All right, so let's jump right in. The decades that came right after the American Civil War, wow. This was a period of such explosive growth and really revolutionary change. It basically built the modern America that we live in today. You can think of it as a massive nationwide upgrade, one that would connect a pretty fractured country and totally define its future. So let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine it's 1860. You're in New York, and you absolutely have to get an urgent message to someone in California. How in the world do you do it? No phones, no internet, nothing like that. You'd have to rely on the most cutting-edge, high-speed technology of the day, which was the Pony Express. This thing was legendary. A whole system of riders on horseback, just racing mail across the country in a giant relay. It was a total marvel of logistics and pure human endurance. And for a minute there, it was the fastest thing going. But its time at the top? Shockingly brief. I'm not kidding, just 1 year. The second those telegraph lines finally connected the continent, letting messages fly at the speed of electricity, poof, the Pony Express was basically done overnight. And that incredible speed of change, that's really the big theme for what we're talking about today. But, a telegraph can't move people or goods. For that, America needed something way, way bigger. And that something was the Transcontinental Railroad. Seriously, you should think of this as the internet of the 19th century. It wasn't just a new way to get from point A to point B. This was a piece of technology that was going to shrink the continent and completely rewire the entire American economy and society. So, how does a project this massive even get off the ground? Well, the government stepped in. Right in the middle of the Civil War, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Acts, which basically subsidized two private companies to get this thing built. But the actual work, the backbreaking labor, that fell to thousands of immigrant workers, mostly Chinese and Irish, who faced incredibly dangerous conditions for very, very little pay. Now, that word subsidy is super important here. A subsidy is just when the government gives money, or in this case, a ton of land and loans, to a private company to help them achieve a big public goal. And let's be real. Without these subsidies, building something as huge and expensive as the Transcontinental Railroad would have been pretty much impossible. So after years of just grueling, dangerous work, the two lines, the Central Pacific building east from California and the Union Pacific building west from Nebraska, they finally met. It all came together on May 10th, 1869 at a place called Promontory, Utah. They drove the final golden spike, and a simple telegraph message flashed across the entire nation. Done. Just like that, for the first time ever, America was truly connected coast to coast.
And get this, the railroad didn't just conquer space, it conquered time. Before the railroad, every single town just set its own clock by the sun. You can imagine the chaos that caused for train schedules. So to fix all that, the railroad companies themselves created 4 distinct time zones across the country. Yep, the very same ones we use today. It was a crazy moment where corporate needs literally changed how every single American experienced a day. Okay, so with the railroad came a flood of new people and new opportunities, and this is what created the unique, iconic culture of the American frontier. We're talking about the era of cowboys, homesteaders, and, of course, the Wild West.
The American cowboy is such an icon, right? But where did this whole idea come from? Well, it was a pretty simple chain of events. People in the East were getting wealthier and wanted to eat more beef. That created a huge demand, which led to massive cattle herds down in Texas. And, well, somebody had to manage all those cows. The American cowhands who took the job didn't invent the role. They adopted the tools, the clothing, and the techniques from the original cowboys, the Mexican vaqueros. Now, you've got these boom towns popping up all along the railroad, and they're filled with a mix of rowdy cowboys and actual outlaws. Official law enforcement was often miles and miles away, so sometimes regular citizens just took the law into their own hands, forming what we call vigilante groups. This messy reality, often blown way out of proportion, is what helped create the whole myth of the Wild West. But it wasn't all cowboys and outlaws out there. A huge driver of settlement was the Homestead Act. It offered 160 acres of federal land to pretty much anyone willing to farm it. And what was pretty remarkable for the time is that this offer was open to women and to Black Americans. But, and this is a really crucial point, this land wasn't empty. It was almost always land that had been promised by treaty to indigenous peoples. So hundreds of thousands of families pack up everything and head west to build a new life, to farm the Great Plains. But for a lot of them, that dream soured really fast. Life became this brutal cycle of debt and despair, and it led to one of the biggest political rebellions in all of American history. See, these farmers were caught in this brutal economic trap where their own success was actually their undoing. As more of them moved west and produced more food, the supply just skyrocketed. When that happens, prices totally collapse and they ended up losing money. They started to blame the railroads for charging crazy high shipping costs and the banks for these predatory interest rates. This all led to a huge fight over the nation's money supply. So here's the bottom line. Under the gold standard, money was scarce, which made every dollar worth more. That's great if you have money, but it's terrible if you have debts. Farmers who were drowning in debt supported free silver. They wanted to add silver to the money supply to cause inflation, which would make their debts way easier to pay off. All this anger and frustration had to go somewhere, and it exploded into a whole new political movement. Farmers got organized, they formed the Populist Party in 1892, and they demanded some major reforms. They really had a shot, especially after the huge economic panic of 1893. But in the critical election of 1896, their guy, William Jennings Bryan, lost to William McKinley, and that populist wave just crashed.
And as that populist movement started to fade, so did the very idea that had defined America for a century, the idea that there was always a vast, open frontier. The final chapter of that story was about to be written. By the late 1880s, that free land from the Homestead Act was pretty much all gone. So, under immense pressure, the government opened up the last large block of so-called unsettled land, Oklahoma. But here's the thing, this was Indian territory. It was the land that had been promised as a permanent home for indigenous nations who had been forcibly removed from their lands decades earlier. At noon on April 22, 1889, a starting gun fired, and the Oklahoma land rush began.
With that final, chaotic rush for land, something profound really shifted. The U.S. Census Bureau officially declared that there was no longer a continuous frontier line, and historian Frederick Jackson Turner just perfectly captured the weight of this moment with these famous words, arguing that the frontier, that whole process of settling the West, was the single most important thing in shaping the American character, and now it was gone. You see, the closing of the frontier was so much more than just a line on a map. It really marked a psychological turning point for the whole nation. For the first time, America had to look inward and also outward for its future. The age of westward expansion was over, and that set the stage for a whole new century of challenges and a brand new role for America in the world.